بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
The historical claims of other religions are unverifiable. 1400 years ago, a man named Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, admired for his selflessness, chivalry, and sincerity by everyone around him, claimed that he was receiving the Quran as revelations from God. Based on what we've seen so far, if he really did make that claim, then it would make sense for it to be true, as there were many prophets and messengers that made the claim before. But did he really make that claim? Did he even exist? Consider, for example, the claim of Buddhism that 2,500 years ago, a man named Buddha found enlightenment under a tree. This claim is historically unverifiable. The sources of this belief are either oral traditions that have been changed and embellished over time, or they are written sources of unknown origin. Not only is the authorship of these sources unknown, the information that the different sources contain is contradictory and contains clear exaggerations. We have no evidence that Buddha even existed, let alone any evidence that he sat under a tree or that he ever claimed to receive enlightenment. Now, we're not saying that it's not true. We're just saying that there isn't concrete evidence to support that. Does that make sense? Without these facts, we cannot even begin to evaluate whether or not his enlightenment was genuine. We are not just saying that we don't know any of these things. We are saying these things cannot be known. They are historically unverifiable. Now consider the claim of Christianity that 2,000 years ago, i.e., that God sent His only Son to die for the sins of humanity. We know that this claim is false because if God had a son, He would resemble contingent human beings and animals, which is impossible. But let's put this rational evidence aside for the moment. Let's assume, hypothetically, that it is possible for God to have a son. Even if that were hypothetically possible, it wouldn't become true simply by claiming it. It would need to be substantiated with evidence. But the claim that he had a son, not a son, correct that please, and that he died for the sins of humanity is historically unverifiable. It is based on oral traditions that have been changed and embellished over time, or on written sources of unknown origin. These written sources also contradict each other, and they make claims that are clearly exaggerated. Just like Buddhism, the historical claims of Christianity are unverifiable. The central historical claims of Islam are mass transmitted. This is what we call sanad. Our scholars mentioned if it wasn't for sanad, the sound transmission of information, the message of Islam would have been lost. So he's going to talk about this idea of mass transmission and verification of information. And so actually, sanad is one form of mass transmission. Mass transmission is one form of sanad. So mass transmission is called mutawatir, which he will share. And sanad is the general chain of transmission. So sanad is a chain of transmitting information. Does that make sense? So for example, I claim, that the Prophet ﷺ said something. I have to provide you a chain of transmission of that information. So I say, I heard Hamza, who told me that he heard Ismail, who told me that he heard Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu say that the Prophet ﷺ said such and such and such. That's a chain of transmission. One form of that chain of transmission, or that sanad, is something called mutawatir. Mutawatir is when there are so many chains of transmission, it's mass transmitted. It could not have been fabricated. There couldn't have been a mistake of any type. Is that clear? What do we call that? Mutawatir. That's the highest form of authenticity. And so the Quran is mutawatir, it's mass transmitted, and there are a large body of ahadith that are more mass transmitted. And so this is the highest form of transmission of knowledge. You learned about this in the science of hadith. If you ever want to get into this, the science of hadith, you would explore this in great length. But we'll continue. Unlike Buddhism, Christianity, or any other major world religion, the central historical claims of Islam are verifiable because they have been mass transmitted, mutawatir. Mass transmission, tawatur, is a technical term that is used by Muslim scholars to describe a report that is transmitted by such large numbers of people that it is impossible for them to have conspired to lie. All right, I want you guys to get that definition, okay? It is transmitted by a large number of people that it is impossible for them to have conspired to lie. Meaning so many people are saying it, it is impossible for them to have conspired to lie about this thing. There could not have been a plan that they came together to create false information. Is that clear? That is what we're saying about mass transmission. He's going to give us an example. For example, it is mass transmitted that the city of Mecca exists. If you've never been, I mean, just you hear from everywhere, it's impossible to say the city doesn't exist. For hundreds of years, even before there was such a thing as live video footage, people who have never visited Mecca have known with absolute knowledge, absolute certainty that it exists. Their certainty that Mecca exists came from the fact that there are huge numbers of people from every city in the Muslim world who have visited Mecca and returned to tell everyone else about it. These numbers are so large that it is impossible for all of them to be part of a global conspiracy to uphold the mass delusion over many hundreds of years that the city of Mecca exists. Meaning if somebody was lying, it would have become known, right? You cannot lie about something like that and get away with it, right? On a global scale. So he's saying the mass transmission is clear that this is a fact and true. Whenever anything is reported by so many eyewitnesses that it is impossible for them to have conspired to lie, we say that it is mass transmitted. Other examples of mass transmitted historical events include major wars like the First World War. The fact that 1400 years ago, a man named Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam claimed that he was receiving the Quran as revelation from God is mass transmitted. It is, in other words, reported by so many eyewitnesses that it is impossible for them to have conspired to lie. Is that clear? That he existed, that he made this claim is mass transmitted. Compare that to Buddhism. You don't have that. It's just scarce, or unknown origin scriptures, and then contradictory information as well. But regarding Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's unanimous. When he existed, where, the period, the location, his companions, these are things that all eyewitnesses agreed to. There's no confusion or disagreement. Or with example, Jesus being the Son of God, it isn't mass transmitted. The sources of the Bible are contradicting each other very often. Their authors are unknown. A lot of the facts are unverifiable. A lot of the texts that are referred to could be interpreted in many ways. It isn't mass transmitted by eyewitnesses who have seen the Prophet Prophet Isa alayhi salam. Whereas with Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the mass transmission by his companions have been well documented. Their names, their full names, their families, their upbringing, their entire biography has been documented. Who they are and how they've been mentioned, this information has been well recorded. There's no such record of any other religion like that of how Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was documented. That is kind of the argument that he's making here. Personally, when I would talk about the purpose of life, I would probably have taken a different approach than the author. But we'll go along with his approach. All right. He took us from the purpose of life, then he's getting into prophethood, which makes sense because the rest of the book will transition into prophethood. Does that make sense? And so, generally, when you study theology, there's three categories. One is uluhiyat, belief in God and matters of belief in God. Second is nubuwat, belief in prophethood and matters pertaining to prophets. And third is sam'iyat, belief in the unseen, matters of transmission. God has told us these things. There's Jannah, there's Nar, there's Jinn, there's angels. This is belief in the unseen. Right? So generally theology is one of these three categories. You're studying one of these three. So now, up to chapter 10, all we've been studying is uluhiyat, belief in God, and matters pertaining to belief in God. Right now, he's using the purpose of life to transition us from that to prophethood and belief in matters of prophethood. Do you guys see that? But the way he's using the purpose of life, I feel like it could have been presented a little bit more different personally, but I think it's still good, and we'll go through it inshallah ta'ala. He says here, sorry, where did I stop? Okay, the second paragraph, kind of that second sentence. And the mass transmission of the fact that a man named Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam claimed that he was receiving the Quran as revelation from God can be seen from the fact that he was born into the most influential family in ancient Arabia, the tribe of Quraysh, who lived in Mecca and were the custodians of the Kaaba, a physical structure that still stands to this day, which was at that time the religious and cultural center of the Arabian Peninsula. It housed hundreds of idols of the pagan cult of ancient Arabia. People from all across the Arabian Peninsula would visit and venerate these idols, which were cared for by the family that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was born into. He was born into the noblest line of this family, and his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and so on back for many generations were famous tribal leaders. He was thus born into something akin to a royal family, and the historical circumstances surrounding his birth leave no doubt about his existence and identity. The fact that he claimed that he was receiving the Quran as revelation from God is also mass transmitted. He taught the Quran and its monotheism in ancient Arabia, and within about 20 years, he transformed the Arabian Peninsula so that the ancient Arabian pagan cult ceased to exist and was replaced by the religion that he taught. After he passed away, thousands of his followers took his message all over the world. As a result of the battles that they fought, the Persian Empire ceased to exist, and the Byzantine Empire was brought to the verge of collapse. The followers of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ founded the most powerful civilization of the time. That civilization continues to exist down to the present day. Now, there's no political power to this civilization, but the faith of this civilization remains strong and firm although we've weathered great trials and tribulations, world wars, just 1,400 years of challenges, conspiracies, attempts to reform the religion. There are people who specialize in the reformation of Islam, and they've all failed. They said, one of them came to he said, this religion is not reformable. You can't. A book that says it is perfect. It is perfect, and every verse, every word of it is from God. How are you going to reform it? As soon as you try to take something out, you will have corrupted the book, so nobody will accept that from you. So these reformers have tried, but it is literally impossible. There's no central body of Islamic authority for whom you need to get permission. The Pope today can say, homosexuality is allowed in Christianity, and now the Christian world adopts it, because it's subject to a central authority. In Islam, there's no such thing. There's no central body you can go to, be like, here's a new interpretation of the Quran. They give it approval, now the Muslims adopt it. No such thing. This deen, Allah has fortified it. It is uncorruptible, unchangeable, non-reformable. Now with that, Islam is adaptable. And that is why you see Islam was adopted by Muslims across the world without forcing them to give up their unique cultures and qualities and languages and so on and so forth. From East Asia all the way to West Africa to North America, people maintain their tradition, their languages, their cultures, their preferences, their foods, their clothing, but they're given certain guidelines. Adhere to justice, adhere to modesty, adhere to morality, worship God alone. But you are allowed to be your individual, unique societies and cultures. You don't have to give up who you are as a people. Rather, Islam will just increase the goodness that you already have in yourselves. But continuing. Ever since that time, the religious rites of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ have been publicly performed by millions, even billions of people all over the world. They give the adhan, they prostrate in prayer, they fast in Ramadan, they make pilgrimage, and they visit the place he was buried, Medina. From the time that he made this claim all the way down to this time, there are so many people who are all saying that the name Muhammad ﷺ, whose existence and identity are mass transmitted, claimed that he received the Quran as revelation from God, and that it is impossible for them to have conspired to lie. That a man named Muhammad ﷺ claimed that he received the Quran as revelation from God is not like the Buddhist claim nor is it like the Christian claim. Unlike those claims, this claim is verifiably true because it is mass transmitted. Not only is the claim verifiably true, but it would make sense for the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to be truthful in his claim. It would make sense for him to actually be God's messenger, right? It does make sense that God did not create us and leave us, right? It makes sense. If somebody says God sent a messenger, yes, it makes sense. The only question is, can we verify he's a messenger? That is a valid question, right? But the fact that God sent a messenger is not something that doesn't make sense. It would make sense for him to actually be God's messenger because our existence would then have a purpose, just like everything else in the universe. In the chapters that come next, we will learn the evidence for the fact that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was indeed God's messenger to mankind. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, yes.